So this video is going to focus on one of the 4 types of tissues that we have in our body. So at this point in time, we've talked about cells and how cells work and how the proteins that the cells make give those cells certain jobs and how, structure determines function. So the shape of those cells, we're going to have them do something. Well, when you get a group of cells working together, you get your tissues. And so we're going to look at the 4 different types of tissues, because once you understand the tissues, we can understand what's going on with organs. Now, in the case of tissues, like I said, tissues come together to make organs. And you're going to see that you have a type of tissue called epithelial tissue, which is what this video is going to focus on. And that's the tissue that makes up all the linings, all the membranes of your body. And then we have muscle tissue, which is the tissue that's responsible for movement. Then we have nervous tissue, which, as you know, creates electricity and helps your body communicate. And then you have kind of like the leftovers. It's like a hodgepodge that we're going to call connective tissue. But this video is just going to focus on what tissues are, and then this kind of tissue in particular. So if you have the anatomy coloring book, what we're going to do today goes along with page 8 in the coloring book. So, a whole bunch of different types of tissues. Now, like I mentioned before, we've talked about all these different types of cells, and structure determines function. So based on the types of proteins that a cell makes, that's going to give that cell a certain job. And so when groups of cells come together and work together, they're going to form different kinds of tissues. And when tissues come together and work together, that's going to be what forms your organs. So before we start talking about organs, you have to understand the 4 primary tissues. Again, epithelial tissue's main job is to line things. So any membrane you have in your body is going to be made from epithelial tissue. And actually, when you touch your skin, you're not touching an organ, you're touching the membrane around the organ. Connective tissue is kind of a leftover. It can literally connect something like tendons and ligaments, or it can figuratively connect something like blood. Muscle tissue is used for movement, and the nervous tissue will be used to create electricity. So what we're going to focus on in this video is epithelial tissue. And again, epithelial tissue is what forms the membranes of your body. And so again, if you have the anatomy coloring book, page 8 goes over the different categories of epithelial tissue. Now, any membrane in your body is made from epithelial tissue. And so every time we talk about an organ, we're going to talk about the membrane. Every organ in your body has a membrane that goes around it. Any organ that's hollow has a membrane on the inside of it. And this is what we call membranous epithelial. It's going to form the coverings, which means it's over, or the linings, which means it's inside. But whenever we talk about an organ, we're going to come back to epithelial tissue because every organ has a membrane around it. Now, in the case of epithelial tissue, just a few terms that we need to make sure we understand, because this is going to be true for all kinds of tissue. You're going to see the term cellularity in regards to different types of tissue. When you see the term cellularity, just as this says, this is referring to how the cells are arranged. Are they stacked on top of each other? Does it just look like somebody's just dropped a bunch of things on the floor and they're just, randomly scattered all over the place? But remember, structure determines function. So how the cells are arranged in an organ or in a tissue are going to affect the job that that tissue and organ is going to have. But when we deal with epithelial tissue has what we call a dense cellularity. So that means the cells are tightly packed together. So if you have the anatomy coloring book, you can look on page 8 and you'll see the drawings they have of different types of epithelial tissue. And you'll see that those cells are tightly packed together. There's no space between those cells. Well, that's going to help give strength to the tissue. Now, epithelial tissue are membranes in your body. And so if you're a membrane around the outside of the outside of the organ, you're helping hold that organ in place. Okay? All of the membranes in your body surround organs. And so if you think about it, we stand upright. We don't want all of our organs being pulled downward due to gravity. So the membranes help hold them in place. So our membranes have to be strong. So when you see, and some types of tissue are what we call loosely packed. Epithelial tissue is not this, but when things are loosely packed, there's not a lot of space, there's a lot of space between the cells. But like I said, if you look at page 8 in the anatomy coloring book, you will see how these cells have what's called a dense cellularity. Okay? They're tightly packed together. Okay? Now, in the case of epithelial tissue, if you look at the pictures, there's no blood vessels in any of these. Your epithelial tissue is so tightly packed, there's no room for blood vessels. So that term means avascular. So therefore, epithelial tissue cannot be very thick. If you think about a membrane, okay, you've all had your skin peel off before. That's about what a membrane looks like. It looks like tissue paper. That's where tissue paper gets its name from. Well, since it's avascular, it has to rely on osmosis and diffusion for all of its nutrients. So it can't be very thick. I like to use the example, think about the room and all the tables in the room and all the chairs and the desk and how we have them lined up in rows. Well, what if I only had one bag of M&Ms? Or, so I just gave that one bag of M&Ms to a table and I said, you're hungry, take as many M&Ms as you want and then pass it back. By the time it got to the third row, that bag of M&Ms would probably be empty. So therefore, you can't let epithelial tissue be very thick, or else the cells would starve. Now, because epithelial tissue forms linings and coverings, we talk about how it has a top and it has a bottom. What we consider the bottom layer of the tissue, that's what we call the basal surface because it's at the base. And then the top portion of the tissue would be the apical surface. Now, like I mentioned, when you touch your skin, you're actually touching the epidermis, which means above the dermis. Well, your epidermis is actually a membrane. Remember, every organ in your body has a membrane that goes around it. Well, your organ is the dermis. It's living and it's made up of all these different types of tissues. Well, your epidermis is the membrane around your dermis. So your epidermis is almost entirely epithelial tissue. Well, when you touch your skin, when you put your hand on your arm, you're actually touching the apical surface of that tissue. The basal surface would be under all these layers, and the basal surface is where the membrane attaches to the organ. So I'm going to swing down here for a minute. There's my fire. It's 19 degrees outside. If I swing down to the anatomy coloring book, what we've got here is one type of epithelial tissue. So this part up here would be the apical surface, and down here where it attaches to the organ is going to be the basal surface. So we have apical surface and we have basal surface. We'll come back up. Now, I've mentioned before how membranes are very much like saran wrap. And you know that saran wrap does not stay on very well. If you just take saran wrap and cover the top of the cup, it doesn't stick very well. Now, if you put saran wrap on the bottom and wrap the entire cup, it stays a little bit better. Well, your epithelial tissue is a lot like saran wrap. You've got to somehow stick it. You've got to somehow attach it, or it's going to slide right off. And so notice epithelial tissue does not directly attach to the organ that it's covering. So for example, in this picture, what I've got here is a picture of your trachea. And your trachea is made from cartilage. This down here is the cartilage that makes up your trachea. And this right here is the lining of your trachea. And your trachea is actually fuzzy. Your trachea has cilia in it. So when you breathe, this cilia, remember we said hair helps trap trash? The cilia is going to trap trash. So this is the membrane lining the inside of your trachea, and this is the cartilage that actually makes the trachea up. Well, somehow I have to stick this membrane onto the cartilage to keep it from sliding off. So I have to have something like a glue. So there's actually a layer of connective tissue in between it. And that layer of connective tissue is called the basal lamina. It's also called the basement membrane. Now, later in a different video, we'll talk about connective tissue, and we'll actually talk about what kind of connective tissue this is. But in this picture, right here, is the connective tissue. It's going to kind of glue the membrane onto the organ, or else the membrane will just slide off. Okay? You know, we stand up, gravity's going to pull, and the membrane will just slide right on down your trachea. So we have to have a glue that's going to hold your membrane on. And that glue is going to be a special type of connective tissue that you're going to see later. And we call it the basal lamina or the basement membrane. Now we can use this as a marker for cancer. You guys have all heard of benign tumors, you've heard of malignant tumors. Well, first of all, when you hear cancer, that's not a good thing. And you guys now know that cancer are cells that just keep dividing and keep dividing and keep dividing, and they basically kill the normal cells that are trying to do their jobs. Well, if you have to have cancer, you want to hear the word benign. In the case of a benign tumor or benign cancer, you have cells that are cancerous, so they just go through constant mitosis. Well, most benign tumors are contained because most benign tumors occur in epithelial tissue. So benign tumors are going to happen in the membrane above the basal lamina. Because remember up here, there are no blood vessels. So therefore, the cancer cells have a very hard time spreading to other parts of your body. When you have a benign tumor, that tumor is contained in one area. So the doctor can go in and hopefully surgically remove that tumor, and then with radiation, they'll radiate the area around that tumor to make sure they've killed all the cancerous cells. And a lot of times you don't have to do chemotherapy because the cancer hasn't spread anywhere. When you hear the term malignant tumor, those cancer cells tend to form in the organ. So it's below the basement membrane. It's not in the membrane, it's in the organ itself. And there's blood vessels there. So malignant cancers can spread throughout the body because the cancerous cells can get picked up in the blood vessel, in the bloodstream, and move all over the place. So when you have malignant tumors, or malignant cancer, that's when you would probably have to deal with chemotherapy. Because what chemotherapy is, it is a drug that stops the formation of mitotic spindles. And we've talked about mitosis. And you know you need those mitotic spindles to pull the chromatids apart in anaphase. Well, cancerous cells, all they're doing is going through mitosis. So when people take chemotherapy, these drugs are focusing on cells going through mitosis. Well, when we talk about skin, you're going to see, that's how your hair grows. Your basically mama hair cells, all they do is go through mitosis. So that's why when people are on chemo, they lose their hair, because hair cells go through mitosis. The drug is looking for cells that go through mitosis, so it temporarily kind of stops that. But hopefully when you stop taking chemo, the cells that are supposed to be going through mitosis kick back in and do what they're supposed to. So in the case of epithelial tissue is going to be above the organ. It's the membrane above it, or like in your heart has hollow chambers. The membrane's going to line it. It helps reduce friction. Your blood vessels are hollow. So you have a membrane on the outside of your blood vessels, and you have a membrane on the inside of your blood vessels. So let's take a look at different types of membranes. Now, when we talk about classification of epithelial tissue, if you have the anatomy coloring book, on page 8, you'll see where it talks about simple epithelial, and you'll see where it talks about stratified epithelial. We don't really talk about glandular epithelial until we actually talk about specific glands. But you'll see simple epithelial, and you'll see squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and what's called pseudostratified columnar. Under stratified epithelial, you'll see stratified squamous, you'll see transitional, Well, this is how we classify tissues. Anytime you see simple, simple means that that tissue is just one cell layer thick. So for example, your eardrum. Your eardrum is a window. You can see through it. It's made from what we call simple squamous tissue. So anytime you see simple, it's just made from one layer of cells. So if you look at the anatomy coloring book on page 8, you can see how all of these are just one layer of cells. So they're not going to be very thick. So anytime you see simple, remember structure determines function, these membranes are going to be responsible for secretion or absorption. So for example, the capillaries of your body are made from simple squamous tissue. And you're going to learn what squamous is in a minute. Well, your capillaries are where all of your nutrient and waste product exchange take place. In order for diffusion and osmosis to happen, remember you can't be very thick. So whenever you see simple, you're just one layer of cells. You'll also see stratified. If you're stratified, you're going to have more than one layer. And you can see that on page 8, how they have different types of stratified tissue. And so, since stratified tissue is thicker, its main job is to basically hold something in place or help protect that organ. So most of the membranes on the outside of the organ are going to be made from stratified tissue. Most of the membranes on the inside of the organs are going to be made from simple tissues. Well, we can also classify them based on the shapes of the cells, because remember, structure determines function. So if you have a different shape, you're going to have a different job. So we have these different types of epithelial tissue. And some of these, if you look on page 8, it talks about simple epithelial. You'll see simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and what's called pseudostratified columnar. You'll then see what's called stratified squamous. You also have stratified cuboidal. They just don't have it in the coloring book. And then you have something called transitional. Well, if you'll notice in the case of simple, these are just one layer of cells. In the case of stratified, you have multiple layers of cells. So let's look at the shapes. Anytime you see squamous, squamous means that those cells are flat. And you can see that on page 8 in the anatomy coloring book. Obviously, if you're cuboidal, you're going to be cube-shaped. If you're columnar, you're going to be long and skinny like a column. Now, so when you see simple squamous, that means you're just one layer of flat cells. Well, as you can see from this and the coloring book, you can have simple squamous, you can have stratified squamous. You can have simple cuboidal, you can have stratified cuboidal. But notice with the other three, your columnar, pseudostratified columnar, or transitional. There is no stratified columnar. Notice there's no simple here, and there's nothing there. And I'm going to talk about that here in just a moment. So let's look at squamous tissue. In the coloring book, you'll see stratified squamous, you'll see simple squamous. Well, remember, anytime you see simple, that means you're going to probably line something. And your main job is to absorb and secrete. So, for example, your lungs look like soap bubbles. And you guys all know soap bubbles are clear, and they're really thin, and they're really delicate. Well, this is actually a picture of lung tissue. You would be able to see through it just like a soap bubble. And so this makes up the air sacs of your lungs, which we call alveoli. This is also what lines your blood vessels. It lines the inside of your heart. It lines lots of different things, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. You can also have stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Stratified means you've got lots of layers. Squamous means that the cells are still flat. So when you touch your skin, you're actually touching some stratified squamous epithelial tissue. The inside of your mouth, your cheek cells, are also stratified squamous tissue. Remember, your saliva has acid in it, so we want a thicker layer there to help protect the organ underneath. Okay. Now in this picture here, this is just another example of stratified squamous tissue. This is your epidermis. So when you touch your skin, this is what you're touching. This is the dermis down here, and that black line represents your basal lamina. Well, these cells here are dead, so they don't have a nucleus. These cells here are living, okay? But most of this is squamous tissue. So we'll talk more about this when we do skin, but here's your epidermis, and here's your dermis. This is the organ, okay? And every organ has a membrane that goes around it, so the membrane that goes around our dermis is called the epidermis. And it's mostly, like I said, stratified squamous tissue. Well, you also have collamer, simple collamer. And so as you can see in your coloring book, we find a lot of the simple collamer in our digestive system. Well, they're simple, so they're still just one layer, so they're still going to absorb and secrete, but they're a little bit longer, and that basically gives your body a little bit of extra protection. Because you know in your digestive system, you're going to have toxins, you're going to have poisons, you're going to have bad stuff. And so you want to make sure that you don't absorb the acids and things like that. So even though it's simple, it's just one layer, by having these cells longer, it basically gives you a little bit more protection. But this is what makes up, again, most of your digestive system. So this would be the membrane, that dark line there would be the basal lamina, and then that would be the organ underneath. So if you look on page 8 in the coloring book, it shows you the simple collamer tissue, and you can see that it's what lines your digestive system. Now, you can have simple cuboidal, you can have stratified cuboidal. They just don't have stratified cuboidal in your coloring book. But again, it's simple, so it's going to secrete and absorb. And we find this in a lot of the tubes that we have in our body. What you're seeing here is pictures of the inside of your kidneys. Your kidneys are actually made up of thousands of these little tubes. And those tubes help filter your blood and help make urine. Well, this is one of those tubes. It's called the nephron. This is another tube. And you can see the cuboidal cells that line that tube. It also makes up the surface of the ovary. Ladies, our ovaries hold eggs. And when we ovulate, the little chamber that the egg is in pops so the egg can come out. So therefore, we need one layer in order to secrete all those hormones, and it has to be thin enough that the egg can pop out. Now, like I said, there is stratified cuboidal. It's just not in your coloring book. Now, you also have something, I don't think I have a slide for it. Oh, did I lose my slide? Hold on. Nope, it's the next one. All right. You have something called transitional. And when things transition, they change. Now, notice it doesn't say simple, it doesn't say stratified. Anytime you see transitional is always stratified tissue. That's why in the coloring book it says stratified epithelial, you'll see transitional. In the case of transitional, as you can see here, it's made from a combination of shapes, and it allows the tissue to stretch and expand. So if you look on page 8 in the coloring book, you can see how it has it when it's shrunken, and you can see it has it when it's expanded. And we find these in organs that have to be able to open and close, open and close. So for example, this type of tissue lines a lot of your excretory system, which you guys know of as the urinary system. The bladder, as you know, holds urine. So you need a lining that's thick, because remember, stratified is going to protect something. Because if this were your bladder, you'd have urine up here, and urine's an acid. So you need a lining that's thick to protect the organ itself, which is smooth muscle, the bladder. That's your basement membrane right there. Okay. Well, also you guys know your bladder shrinks and it expands. It shrinks and it expands depending on how much urine you have in it. So that tissue needs to be able to do that. The ureter is a tube that comes from the kidney down to the bladder. So as your kidney makes urine, it flows down the ureter into the bladder. So depending on how much urine your kidney's making, that tube has to be able to stretch a little bit. And the urethra is basically the tube you pee out of. So again, depending on how much urine's coming out, that tube might have to swell open a little bit. So transitional is always stratified. The opposite of that is pseudostratified columnar. And if you'll notice in the coloring book, pseudostratified columnar is found under simple epithelial. Pseudostratified columnar is just one layer of cells. But if you'll notice, they're kind of wine-shaped, wine glass shaped. So it looks like there's two layers. Pseudo means false, stratified means layer. Pseudostratified columnar is always one layer of cells. So it's a single layer of cells with differing heights. So I like the way the coloring book drew it because it makes those cells look like wine glasses. Some of the wine glasses are up, some of the wine glasses are tipped over. Okay. So in this picture here, it looks like there's two layers of cells, okay, because some of the wine glasses are sitting up, so those are their nucleuses, and some of the glasses are flipped over, and so that's their nucleus. And a lot of pseudostratified columnar tissue has cilia, which you see here. Okay. This is the picture of the trachea again. So this would be the hollow part of your trachea, so this would be your apical surface. This is the epithelial tissue, and that right there is the basal lamina. So because the way that the cells form, they look a lot like multiple layers. Now, a lot of pseudostratified columnar also plays a role in the secretion of mucus. So you have pseudostratified columnar on the inside of your nose. And like I said, you have it in your trachea as well. Okay. Oh. So that is going to be the video on epithelial tissue.